The woman who ordered security to remove him from the VIP landing zone had no idea she was standing on land that belonged to him. The first helicopter touched down at 9:12 on a clear Thursday morning, its rotor wash sweeping across the private airfield in long waves that bent the grass and rattled the loose metal panels of the nearest hangar. A convoy of black SUVs waited beside the runway. Men in tailored suits checked their watches. Assistants carried tablets and leather folders. Everything about the arrival had been carefully designed to communicate importance. Claire Harrington stepped out of the aircraft wearing a charcoal business coat and dark sunglasses, moving with the confidence of a woman accustomed to walking into rooms where people expected answers from her. At 31 years old, she had spent the last 3 years transforming Harrington Aero Logistics into one of the fastest-growing aviation companies in the Midwest. Investors admired her. Competitors watched her carefully. Employees feared disappointing her. Today was supposed to be another victory. The company was finalizing a regional expansion project that required access to several privately owned aviation properties, and this small airfield outside Cedar Ridge was considered one of the final pieces. Claire had reviewed the financial projections twice during the flight. To her, the location was an asset. A line on a spreadsheet. A signature waiting to happen. She barely glanced at the surrounding property as she walked toward the temporary meeting area near the main hangar. Then she noticed the helicopter. It sat alone near the edge of the field. Old. Faded. The paint had long since lost its shine. The machine looked out of place among the polished aircraft her company normally operated. One landing skid showed visible wear. The body carried the marks of years spent working instead of being displayed. Standing beside it was a man in a weathered brown jacket. He held a toolbox in one hand. Grease marked the sleeve near his wrist. His attention appeared focused entirely on the helicopter rather than the arrival of one of the most powerful executives in the region. Beside him stood a little girl no older than 7. She hugged a worn white rabbit against her chest and watched the helicopters with quiet curiosity. Claire slowed slightly. One of her managers leaned closer. "Probably local maintenance," he said. Claire followed his gaze. The man never looked up. He didn't move toward the arriving executives. He didn't appear impressed. For some reason, that irritated her more than it should have. "This area is restricted today," Claire said. The manager nodded immediately and motioned toward 2 security contractors stationed near the vehicles. The contractors approached the man. The little girl tightened her grip on the rabbit. The man finally looked up. His face revealed nothing. No surprise. No concern. No anger. One of the guards stopped a few feet away. "Sir, we're preparing for a private executive meeting. We'll need you to clear the VIP area." The man glanced toward the runway, then toward the hangar, then back at the guard. "I'm working," he said calmly. His voice carried no challenge. No argument. Just a statement. Claire removed her sunglasses. "Working on that?" she asked, looking directly at the old helicopter. Several executives turned toward the aircraft. A few smiled. "That thing belongs in a museum," she said. Soft laughter spread through the group. The little girl looked up at her father. The man said nothing. He simply rested a hand on the worn metal frame of the helicopter. The silence lasted a moment longer than expected. Then Claire gestured toward security. "Move him outside the meeting perimeter." The guards exchanged a brief glance before stepping forward again. The little girl looked at her father and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. The man answered with a faint smile. Then he picked up his toolbox and began walking away without another word. Around them, nobody noticed the older airport accountant standing near the hangar office window. Nobody noticed him staring at the departing man with growing confusion. And nobody noticed the name printed at the top of the property ownership file resting open on his desk. Ethan Walker did not look back as he carried the toolbox across the field. The morning wind moved steadily through the grass, carrying the fading sound of helicopter rotors toward the distant tree line. Lily walked beside him with the white rabbit tucked beneath one arm, her small boots leaving faint marks in the gravel path that led toward the older hangars. Behind them, the executives returned their attention to contracts, schedules, and expansion plans. Within seconds, most had already forgotten the man they had asked to leave. That was not unusual. Most people forgot Ethan quickly. The small maintenance building sat nearly a quarter-mile from the main runway. Its paint had faded years ago. The coffee machine inside rattled whenever it was used. The wooden desk near the entrance carried stacks of manuals that looked older than some of the aircraft landing there. Ethan set the toolbox on a workbench and removed a pair of gloves. Lily climbed onto a stool near the window. She placed the rabbit beside her and watched the activity outside. "Why did they want us to leave?" she asked. Ethan opened a drawer and searched for a wrench. They had important people arriving. Lily thought about that for several seconds. "Are we not important?" Ethan smiled faintly without looking up. "Everybody is important to somebody." The answer seemed to satisfy her. She nodded and returned her attention to the runway. The old helicopter remained parked exactly where it had been all morning. To most people it looked tired. The paint was faded. Several exterior panels carried signs of age. One of the landing skids showed years of use. But anyone who truly understood aviation would have noticed something different. Every component had been maintained with unusual precision. Every bolt appeared exactly where it should be. Every surface showed evidence of careful inspection rather than neglect. Ethan walked around the aircraft slowly, resting a hand against the fuselage for a moment. The machine had been flying for nearly 30 years. Most helicopters from that era had long since been retired. This one remained operational because someone had refused to let it die. A pickup truck rolled toward the hangar. The driver climbed out carrying a clipboard. His name was Walter Briggs. 64 years old. Airfield accountant. He had worked there longer than most people could remember. Walter approached with an expression that suggested his mind was occupied by something unusual. "You might find this interesting," he said. Ethan looked up. Walter held the clipboard under one arm. "The woman running that meeting keeps asking who owns the western acreage." Ethan returned his attention to the helicopter. "Did you tell her?" Walter laughed quietly. "Not yet." Lily looked between them. "Tell her what?" Walter grinned. "Nothing important." Ethan gave him a look that ended the conversation immediately. Walter cleared his throat and changed subjects. "There is another issue." He pointed toward the executive helicopter parked near the main hangar. One of the pilots requested fuel records. Said something about a warning light they cannot explain. Ethan followed his gaze. The aircraft sat motionless under the morning sun. From this distance it appeared perfectly normal. Yet something about it held his attention for an extra second. Then he returned to his work. Across the property, Claire Harrington stood inside a temporary conference room reviewing documents with her legal team. The meeting should have been simple. Instead, questions kept appearing. Ownership records seemed unusually complicated. Parcel maps referenced entities nobody recognized. Several signatures were missing from the transfer package. Claire disliked uncertainty. She disliked it even more when it slowed progress. She closed the folder and looked through the window toward the distant maintenance buildings. Somewhere beyond them, the quiet man with the worn jacket continued working as if none of this concerned him. For reasons she could not explain, she found herself thinking about him again. By early afternoon the meeting had accomplished far less than Claire Harrington expected. The contracts remained unsigned. The ownership records remained incomplete. Every answer seemed to produce two new questions. She stood near the conference table studying a property map spread across several folders while attorneys exchanged quiet opinions around her. The airfield looked simple from the sky. On paper it looked like a maze. Multiple parcels connected through older agreements. Access rights stretching back decades. Easements that crossed neighboring properties. Nothing about it matched the straightforward acquisition she had been promised. Claire disliked surprises. Especially expensive ones. Across the field, Ethan Walker finished replacing a worn hydraulic fitting on the old helicopter. He wiped his hands with a clean shop towel and stepped back to inspect his work. The machine sat silent beneath the afternoon sun. Lily remained nearby drawing pictures on the back of an old maintenance checklist. Her rabbit rested beside her. "Does it ever bother you?" she asked suddenly. Ethan glanced toward her. "What?" "When people think they know everything about you." Ethan considered the question carefully. Lily always asked questions that sounded simple until you tried answering them. "Not really," he said. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because they were not very nice this morning." Ethan looked toward the distant executive tents. "People see what they expect to see." Lily looked down at her drawing. "That seems like a problem." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face. "Sometimes it is." Walter Briggs emerged from the maintenance office carrying another folder. He walked directly toward Ethan with the expression of a man trying very hard not to enjoy a secret. "You are becoming popular," Walter said. Ethan sighed quietly. "What now?" Walter opened the folder. The lawyers requested historical maintenance records for runway access. Ethan accepted the folder and scanned the first page. His expression never changed. "Send them the records." Walter hesitated. "You know they still have no idea." Ethan closed the folder. "Then let them keep working." Walter shook his head and laughed under his breath before walking away. Meanwhile, near the executive helicopter, a different conversation was unfolding. Two pilots stood beside the aircraft reviewing diagnostic data displayed on a tablet. Neither looked pleased. One of them tapped the screen repeatedly. The warning message remained unchanged. Fuel pressure fluctuations. Intermittent sensor disagreement. Nothing serious enough to ground the aircraft yet. Nothing simple enough to ignore. A maintenance contractor examined the engine compartment for nearly 20 minutes before stepping back without a clear answer. The uncertainty began spreading through the flight crew. Claire noticed immediately. She walked toward them. "What is the issue?" she asked. The senior pilot straightened. "Probably nothing major. We are just verifying a few readings before departure." Claire studied his face. Years in business had taught her to recognize confidence. This was not confidence. "How long?" she asked. "Hopefully not long." The answer failed to reassure her. She looked across the airfield toward the maintenance buildings again. In the distance she could barely make out the silhouette of the old helicopter parked beside the hangar. Beside it stood the same quiet man from earlier. He appeared completely unconcerned with the growing complications surrounding the day's meeting. For reasons she could not explain, that bothered her more than the delayed paperwork. Nearby, one of the younger pilots lowered his voice. "I swear I have seen that helicopter before." The senior pilot glanced up. "Where?" The younger man continued staring across the field. "I do not know. But I have a feeling that machine is worth a lot more than it looks." The warning light refused to disappear. By 3 o'clock the afternoon sun had turned the runway into a sheet of shimmering heat, and the executive helicopter still sat grounded beside the temporary meeting area. 3 different maintenance specialists had inspected it. 2 had connected diagnostic equipment. 1 had spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing system logs. None of them seemed willing to give Claire Harrington a definitive answer. That alone was enough to make the situation feel larger than it probably was. Claire stood beside the aircraft with her arms folded as another technician climbed down from the inspection platform. "Well?" she asked. The technician hesitated. "We are still narrowing it down." Claire looked at him for a moment. "That is the same answer I received an hour ago." The technician glanced toward the senior pilot before speaking carefully. "The readings are inconsistent. We fix one possibility and another appears. We would rather be certain before declaring the aircraft ready." Claire nodded once, though her patience was thinning. Every delay pushed the schedule further behind. Every delay increased costs. And every delay made the unresolved property deal more irritating. A few hundred yards away, Ethan Walker sat on a folding chair outside the maintenance building while Lily colored another picture. The white rabbit rested beside her. The afternoon had settled into a comfortable quiet. A small breeze moved across the field. Ethan sipped coffee from a paper cup and watched aircraft moving through the distant sky. "Can helicopters get sick?" Lily asked suddenly. Ethan lowered the cup. "What makes you ask that?" She pointed toward the grounded executive helicopter. "Everybody keeps looking at it like it has a fever." Ethan followed her gaze. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Machines usually tell you when something is wrong." Lily considered that. "Do people?" Ethan looked at her. "Not always." She nodded as though that answer confirmed something she already suspected. A pickup truck approached again. Walter Briggs stepped out carrying another stack of documents. This time he looked more amused than concerned. "You should see the lawyers," he said. "Half of them think the ownership records were filed incorrectly." Ethan accepted the paperwork. "Were they?" Walter laughed. "Not even close." He leaned against the truck. "One of them asked if there was a hidden investor behind the property." Ethan signed a page and handed it back. "Interesting theory." Walter shook his head. "You are enjoying this more than you admit." Ethan did not answer. Across the field, the senior pilot stared at a maintenance report before slowly lowering it. Something had finally caught his attention. He walked around the helicopter once. Then twice. His eyes moved across the aircraft with growing concentration. Suddenly he looked toward the distant maintenance area. Toward the old helicopter. Toward Ethan. Recognition flickered across his face. Not certainty. Not yet. But something close. He approached Claire immediately. "There might be another option," he said. Claire looked up from her phone. "What kind of option?" The pilot hesitated. "I want to verify something first." Before she could ask another question, he started walking across the airfield. Claire followed his path with her eyes. It led directly toward the maintenance buildings. Directly toward the quiet man everyone had dismissed that morning. The senior pilot's name was Mark Reynolds, and by the time he reached the maintenance building, he was no longer thinking about warning lights or delayed schedules. He was thinking about a memory. A photograph he had seen years earlier in an aviation journal. A helicopter restoration project that had become famous among pilots for reasons most people outside the industry never understood. Ethan Walker looked up as Mark approached. Lily noticed him first. She nudged the rabbit closer against her chest and watched quietly. Mark stopped a few feet away. "I hope I am not interrupting anything," he said. Ethan set down a wrench. "What can I do for you?" Mark glanced toward the old helicopter. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore. The custom modifications. The precision of the restoration work. The rare avionics package hidden beneath the aging exterior. None of it belonged on a machine that looked this ordinary. "I have a strange question," Mark said. Ethan waited. "Did you rebuild that aircraft yourself?" For the first time, a small expression crossed Ethan's face. Not surprise. Recognition. Most of it. Mark looked at the helicopter again. I thought so. Lily looked between the two men. Dad fixes everything. Ethan smiled faintly. Mark laughed quietly. That does not surprise me. For several moments he simply studied the aircraft. Then he lowered his voice. There is a helicopter across the field giving us problems. Warning systems. Fuel pressure inconsistencies. 3 maintenance teams have looked at it. Ethan picked up a cloth and cleaned his hands. And? Nobody can find the cause. Ethan nodded once. That happens. Mark hesitated. Would you be willing to take a look? Ethan's eyes moved toward the distant executive helicopter. The aircraft sat exactly where it had been for hours. Even from this distance he could see technicians moving around it. Lily watched her father carefully. She already knew what answer he would give. Ethan glanced back at Mark. I was asked to leave that area this morning. Mark shifted awkwardly. About that. Ethan raised a hand gently. It is fine. His voice carried no resentment. No anger. Only calm. Mark seemed relieved. Would you at least tell me what you think? Ethan stood and walked several steps forward until he had a clear view across the airfield. He remained silent for nearly 20 seconds. Mark waited. Lily waited. Even Walter Briggs, standing near the office door, quietly stopped pretending not to listen. Ethan studied the aircraft from a distance most mechanics would consider useless. Then he spoke. The warning light is probably not the problem. Mark blinked. What? People focus on warning lights because they are visible. Ethan folded his arms. The issue is likely a sensor disagreement created by inconsistent pressure readings. Mark stared at him. Ethan continued. Check the secondary fuel regulation assembly. Specifically the connector behind the monitoring unit. I would start there. Mark frowned. You can tell that from here? Ethan shrugged slightly. Maybe. The answer sounded almost casual. Mark looked back toward the helicopter. Then back at Ethan. Then back at the helicopter again. He was not certain whether he had just received an educated guess or something far more impressive. Across the airfield, Claire Harrington stood beside the grounded aircraft reviewing another stack of documents when she noticed Mark returning. The expression on his face immediately caught her attention. It was the look of a man who had just discovered something unexpected. Mark Reynolds returned to the executive helicopter carrying nothing except a growing sense that he had overlooked something obvious. Claire Harrington watched him approach. Did you find an answer? She asked. Mark did not respond immediately. Instead, he climbed into the aircraft and requested access to the diagnostic panel once more. The maintenance team gathered around him. Several looked skeptical. One engineer folded his arms. Another checked his tablet. Mark entered a sequence of commands and pulled up a subsystem report that nobody had examined closely during the previous inspections. 10 seconds later his expression changed. 20 seconds after that the engineer beside him leaned closer. Wait, the engineer said. Run that again. Mark did. The same anomaly appeared. A connector inside the secondary fuel regulation assembly was transmitting inconsistent values. Not failed. Not damaged. Simply misreporting pressure readings in a way that confused every other system connected to it. The engineer stared at the screen. How did you know to look there? Mark looked across the airfield toward the maintenance buildings. He did not answer. Within minutes technicians were removing access panels and inspecting the component. The first specialist admitted he had skipped that section because the warning code suggested a different source. The second admitted he had assumed the connector was functioning normally because it had passed its initial diagnostics. The third said nothing at all. Claire listened carefully as the maintenance team worked. Her attention shifted from the aircraft to the distant figure standing beside the old helicopter. For the first time all day, she felt uncertainty creeping into her assumptions. Half an hour later the connector was replaced. The systems were reset. The warning messages disappeared. One by one the indicators returned to normal. The senior engineer stared at the display for several seconds before exhaling slowly. That should not have taken us 4 hours. Nobody disagreed. Across the field, Ethan Walker was tightening a panel on his own aircraft when Walter Briggs emerged from the office carrying another folder. "Looks like your guess was correct," Walter said. Ethan did not look up. "Good." Walter laughed. "That is all you have to say?" Ethan secured the final fastener. The helicopter needed fixing. Walter shook his head. "You really are impossible." Nearby, Lily sat on an overturned crate feeding crackers to a small flock of birds that had gathered near the hangar. She watched her father for a moment before speaking. "Did you help them?" Ethan wiped his hands with a cloth. "Maybe a little." Lily smiled. "You always help people." Ethan looked toward the runway. "Most people are trying their best." Several hundred yards away, the mood around the executive helicopter had changed dramatically. The maintenance teams who had spent hours searching for answers now found themselves discussing a man who diagnosed the problem from across the property. Questions began spreading. Who was he? How did he know? Where had he learned that? One pilot thought he might be a former aviation consultant. Another guessed military aviation. A third insisted he had seen Ethan's name somewhere years ago. Claire listened without participating. Her eyes settled once more on the old helicopter parked beside the maintenance building. The aircraft suddenly looked different. Not newer. Not more impressive. Just different. Like a detail everyone had dismissed too quickly. Then her chief legal advisor approached carrying a thick property file and an expression that suggested another surprise was waiting. "Claire," he said quietly. "We finally identified the individual connected to the ownership records. I think you need to see this." Claire took the property file from her legal advisor and opened it without much expectation. She had spent the entire day reviewing contracts, ownership records, and land agreements. Another folder felt like one more administrative obstacle. Then she reached the first summary page. Her eyes stopped moving. For several seconds she simply stared. "This is correct?" she asked quietly. The attorney nodded. "We verified it 3 times." Claire looked back down. The ownership structure that had confused her entire legal team suddenly made sense. Multiple parcels. Multiple agreements. Decades of aviation easements. Maintenance rights. Fuel operations. Hangar leases. Every major section ultimately connected to a single controlling entity. The name attached to that entity was Ethan Walker. Claire read it again. Then a third time. The same man security had escorted away from the executive area that morning. The same man standing beside the old helicopter. The same man everyone had assumed was a maintenance worker. Her attorney continued speaking. Not only the runway. The hangars. The fuel facilities. The western acreage. The maintenance buildings. All of it. Claire slowly lowered the file. Around her, several executives had begun noticing the conversation. One by one they moved closer. The attorney opened another page. The ownership structure was intentionally private. Most operational agreements were handled through separate entities, which is why nobody immediately recognized the connection. One executive frowned. "You are telling me the entire airfield belongs to him?" "Yes." Silence settled over the group. Earlier laughter suddenly felt very distant. Across the property, Ethan remained completely unaware of the conversation. Or perhaps he was aware and simply did not care. He was helping Lily clean paint markers from the small folding table outside the maintenance building. The afternoon light had begun turning golden. Long shadows stretched across the runway. The day was slowly moving toward evening. "Can we get ice cream later?" Lily asked. Ethan considered the question seriously. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you finish your homework." Lily groaned dramatically. Ethan smiled. Nearby, Walter Briggs watched the exchange while pretending to organize paperwork. He knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the property. He had known for hours. The difference was that now everyone else knew too. Back near the executive helicopter, Claire turned another page in the file. A photograph slid partially free. She pulled it out. The image showed a younger Ethan standing beside several aviation executives during the dedication ceremony for the airfield nearly a decade earlier. He looked different. Slightly younger. The same calm expression. The same quiet posture. Claire stared at the photograph. "Why have I never heard of him?" she asked. Her attorney answered immediately. "Because he rarely appears publicly." Another executive pointed toward the image. "Wait. I know that name." He leaned closer. "Walker Aviation Holdings. My father used to mention them." The attorney nodded. "Same family." The executive's expression changed. That operation was worth a fortune. Claire slowly closed the folder. The assumptions she had carried into the morning were collapsing one after another. The man she had dismissed was not a mechanic working on someone else's property. He was not a caretaker. He was not an employee. Every runway marking. Every hangar. Every acre visible from the executive helicopter belonged to him. And for the first time all day, Claire Harrington felt something she almost never experienced. She was the one who had walked into someone else's world without realizing it. The sun was beginning its descent when Claire Harrington crossed the airfield herself. No assistants followed. No attorneys. No executives. For the first time that day she walked without an audience. The distance between the executive area and the maintenance buildings was not far, yet it felt strangely longer now that she understood who she was approaching. Ethan Walker was standing beside the old helicopter with a maintenance panel open near the rear assembly. Lily sat nearby swinging her legs from a small stool while finishing the last page of her homework. The white rabbit rested against her backpack. Ethan noticed Claire approaching long before she reached them, but he continued working. He neither hurried nor paused. Claire stopped several feet away. For a moment neither spoke. The silence felt different from the one they had shared that morning. Then Claire glanced toward the helicopter. "I owe you an apology." Ethan secured a fastener and set down a wrench. "For what?" The question caught her off guard. "For how I handled things earlier." Ethan looked at her calmly. "You were focused on your work." Claire almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. Most people in her position would have defended themselves or accepted the apology immediately. Ethan did neither. Lily looked between them. "Dad says everybody makes mistakes." Claire smiled despite herself. "Your dad sounds wiser than most executives I know." Lily nodded seriously. "He usually is." Ethan shook his head slightly, but said nothing. Claire glanced toward the old helicopter once more. "Mark told me about the fuel regulation issue." Ethan closed the maintenance panel. "Looks like they solved it." "Because of you." "Because they checked the right place." Claire studied him carefully. The file she had read an hour earlier still felt unreal. The ownership records. The aviation holdings. The photographs. The history. None of it matched the image she had formed that morning. "There is something else," she said. Ethan waited. "One of my pilots recognized your aircraft." For the first time all afternoon, Ethan seemed mildly interested. Claire continued. "Apparently there are people in the aviation community who know exactly what that helicopter is." Ethan glanced toward the machine. The fading sunlight reflected softly across the weathered metal. "A few people remember it." Claire folded her arms. "The restoration project won national awards." Ethan shrugged. "That was a long time ago." At that moment another vehicle approached from the far side of the property. A silver SUV stopped near the maintenance building. An older man stepped out carrying a leather case. The instant Mark Reynolds saw him, he froze. Several executives following behind reacted the same way. Claire noticed immediately. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Mark looked stunned. "That is Robert Sinclair." Claire recognized the name at once. Sinclair was one of the most respected figures in private aviation. Former manufacturer advisor. Industry consultant. A man whose opinion influenced multi-million-dollar aircraft transactions across the country. Robert walked directly toward Ethan. No hesitation. No introduction required. When he reached the helicopter, he stopped and smiled. "I thought it was yours the moment I saw it from the road." Ethan extended his hand. "Good to see you again." Several executives exchanged confused looks. Robert turned toward the aircraft and gently rested a hand against the fuselage. "Still the finest restoration I have ever seen." The words landed with remarkable force. Not because they were loud. Because everyone listening understood who had spoken them. Claire watched the reaction spreading through her team. The maintenance crews. The pilots. The attorneys. One by one, people were beginning to realize the quiet man they had overlooked was not merely the owner of the airfield. He was someone whose reputation had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. For several moments nobody spoke. The evening air carried only the distant sound of wind moving across the runway and the occasional call from a bird settling into the trees beyond the property. Robert Sinclair stood beside the helicopter, his presence alone enough to change the atmosphere around the maintenance building. Executives who normally commanded attention now found themselves quietly listening. Pilots who had spent years in aviation exchanged looks of disbelief. Ethan Walker seemed completely unaffected by any of it. He simply closed his toolbox and placed it beside the workbench. Robert smiled as he looked at the aircraft one last time. "You know, there are people who still talk about this restoration project at aviation conferences." Ethan shook his head. "People should find better things to talk about." A few nearby pilots laughed softly. Claire Harrington watched the exchange carefully. Throughout the day she had witnessed one assumption after another collapse. The mechanic was not a mechanic. The quiet man was not an employee. The owner of the old helicopter was not simply a local landholder. Every layer revealed another. Yet Ethan himself had never changed. He remained exactly the same person he had been that morning. Calm. Unimpressed. Focused on work rather than recognition. Claire stepped forward. "I would still like to discuss the property agreement." Ethan looked toward her. There was no triumph in his expression. No satisfaction. No reminder of what had happened earlier. "We can do that." Claire nodded. "Tomorrow?" Ethan glanced toward Lily. The little girl had finished packing her school supplies and was carefully placing the white rabbit inside her backpack. "Tomorrow works." Claire smiled. "Thank you." One of the attorneys standing nearby appeared embarrassed. Another executive looked as though he wanted to apologize. Neither found the words. They were unnecessary. Everyone present already understood what had happened. The lesson required no speech. Walter Briggs watched the entire scene with quiet amusement. He had spent years seeing visitors arrive with assumptions about the airfield and its owner. Most eventually learned the same thing. Some learned faster than others. The executive helicopter was ready to depart now. The warning systems were clear. The pilots were preparing for takeoff. Yet nobody seemed in a hurry. The day had become about something larger than schedules or contracts. Lily walked over and slipped her hand into her father's. "Can we get ice cream now?" she asked. Ethan looked down at her. "Did you finish your homework?" Lily smiled proudly. "Every page." Ethan nodded. "Then I think we can manage ice cream." Robert Sinclair laughed. "That sounds like the smartest decision anyone has made all day." More laughter followed. Genuine this time. Not directed at anyone. Not at someone's expense. Just a shared moment at the end of a long day. Ethan picked up the toolbox. The sun sat low on the horizon now, casting long golden light across the runway he owned, the hangars he owned, and the airfield everyone else had spent the day trying to understand. He never mentioned any of it. He never reminded anyone who he was. He simply took Lily's hand and started walking toward the parking area. Claire watched them go. The executives watched them go. The pilots watched them go. No one tried to stop him. No one needed another explanation. The quiet man they had overlooked had already said everything important without ever needing to announce himself. As father and daughter disappeared into the warm evening light, Lily looked up and asked one final question. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Why are people looking at you differently now?" Ethan smiled and opened the truck door for her. "Because now they see what was there all along."